Hello, good evening. Hello and welcome to the Conduit. My name is Lily Blacksall and I'm head of programming here. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, and I have a question for you. What if everything you've been told about political persuasion is wrong? Dr. Stein Lubrano is with us this evening to challenge the way we think about political change. In conversation with Tim Finch, Sarah will explore what actually works when it comes to shifting perspectives and building a more stable political future. Her bold and brilliant new book, Don't Talk About Politics, is available from our friends at Stanford's at the back there, and after the conversation, Sarah will be signing copies from that table there. So do stick around and get your copy signed. Also join in the conversation with Sarah and Tim. Raise your hand and we'll bring you a roving microphone. And Conduit members who would really like to keep the conversation going and maybe talk and convene more on the topic of the psychology of change should be sure to come and speak to our wonderful member, Steph French. I hope you don't mind me pointing you out in the front row, just giving a wave there, who's really keen to gather and convene and discuss this topic more. I should also mention for Conduit members, we have another event on the 8th of October in this very room with the journalists Emily Casriel and Kitty Drake, who will be discussing Emily's deep listening technique in quite an interactive event for you to get involved with. So yes, we're really digging into how to communicate with those we disagree with at the moment, which just must be something in the air. But I'm getting distracted. I'll tell you a bit more about tonight's speakers. So yes, Dr. Sarah Stein Lubrano holds a PhD from the University of Oxford and a master's degree from the University of Cambridge. Her thinking often reaches the public through the Sense and Solidarity Initiative and the Future Narratives Lab, and she also regularly appears on public radio and a variety of podcasts. She will be in conversation with Tim Finch, who is an acclaimed novelist and former BBC journalist who has led migration and refugee advocacy, working for the likes of Refugee Council, the Institute of Public Policy Research. He founded the migration-focused comms agency IMIX and is a co-founder of Counterpoints Arts. So please give Sarah and Tim a very warm welcome to the stage.
Good evening and welcome to this event to discuss a fascinating and stimulating book, Don't Talk About Politics, How to Change 21st Century Minds, written by Sarah Stein Lubrano. You had a little bit of my bio at the beginning. My name's Tim Finch. I'm now a novelist, but as was suggested in the introduction to us both, I've been variously at other times in my life a Westminster journalist, a policy wonk, a communications director, a community organiser and a political campaigner. I mention all that because all of these are relevant to the subjects we're going to discuss over the next hour and a quarter. Now, those of you who've read Sarah's book will know that it's a sophisticated and multi-layered one, but at its heart is a simple, if somewhat startling contention that talking about politics doesn't change politics. So, if we're going to reverse the slide into populism and authoritarianism that many of us are so worried about at the moment, what can we do instead of debating and arguing? Well, we're going to debate and argue in a civilized way about that question. Before Sarah and I have a conversation, just a word or two about format. It was mentioned that we'll have a conversation between the two of us and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. In terms of the amount of time we'll give to that, well, we'll be a bit flexible depending on how our conversation goes, but roughly 45 minutes of us talking and then about half an hour of you asking questions. And I know that it's always difficult to be the first person to ask a question, but if you could be thinking about what you want to ask while you go along and be that person who dares to put their hand up first, that would be really helpful. Avoid that slightly awkward moment when you say, are there any questions? And there's loads, but nobody seems to want to ask the first one. So please be thinking about them as you go along. So, Sarah.
Hello.
How are you? Enough of me.
I am as well as an American can be in the 25th of September, 2025.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
So I thought we'd frame our discussion, at least initially, around the idea of you being brought in to consult on the founding of a new political party or perhaps an election campaign.
I think given the track record of the last week, I should not do that. But yes, let's pretend.
I'll keep the challenge going for a little bit. We won't stick doggedly to this format, but just to begin with.
As long as I don't have to talk to the leaders of the new party, it'll be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first, I thought what we'd do is, what would you tell them to do if they want to win some people's support? And what would you tell them not to do? So I was struck, for instance, that right at the beginning of the book, you're very sceptical about what's sometimes called the marketplace of ideas, and suggest that that isn't the right forum for political problem solving. Whereas, most political movements think the first thing they need to do is come up with a whole load of policy ideas. So explain your thinking, justify that assertion.
Sure. So the first 2 chapters of my book look at the evidence, or in actually most cases the lack thereof, for this marketplace of ideas. Do people get exposed to ideas in the world through talking, through reading the newspaper, through going on the internet, or through debating or watching debates, and do they change their minds about political issues? And the answer, as I go through in great detail in the book, is no. Pretty much no. People do not seem to change their minds. I think something like 13% of people report having changed their mind about anything from reading something on the internet in the last year. One of the more striking things has to do with debate. People watching debates. We think of debates, I don't know, America is a little bit more intense about this, but we watch presidential debates very intensely, and then we, are very surprised if, wow, it moved by 2%. Up or down based on the debate. But actually, researchers finally went and they took all these debates from all these countries around the world, and they looked at them over decades and decades, and they basically tried to ask this question, which is, does the polling change more on a given day after a debate than another random day during the election cycle? And the answer is no. So really what you're seeing when you see, oh my gosh, Biden is up by 2 points or whatever, or perhaps not this election cycle, is just a random walk. It's just what is not statistically significant in effect, because it's just the way people kind of vary from day to day anyway. The debate itself appears to have no significance. And even the researchers are surprised. They're at Princeton University and they're like, well, this is not what we expected, But in fact, I think one of the things I try to do in my research is look across different fields of psychology and social science and political theory and see, are there trends that are perhaps easier to see when you zoom out of just one discipline? And this trend, where people overestimate constantly the effect that words have in people's political views, that trend is very consistent. It's there in politics. They go through a wonderful study where they give people information about topics they care about or have strong beliefs about, and they see whether they can change their minds. And there are all these seemingly apolitical topics that people change their minds about perfectly fine. You tell them, actually, you didn't understand how fluoride works, let me correct you, no problem, unless they're conspiracists about fluoride. How is your roof fixed? I can tell you. How do toilets work? Let me explain, right? And then you get to things that are political, and the information action gap, as they say, or the information belief gap, is huge. This has almost no effect. People do not change their minds almost at all on issues like gay marriage or abortion or tax policy or defense policy when they're given information that should, in theory, cause them to change their minds. So yes, I would absolutely not start with the marketplace of ideas, because I really care about actually changing the world, right? And in order to do that, it seems that many other things are pretty effective when it comes to politics, but not just giving people new information or ideas or narratives or stories or persuasion or all the things that people get paid lots of fancy money in Westminster to fool around with at the edges, and certainly not debates, because it is actually other things that have a deep underlying grasp on our political beliefs, and it's those things that change our politics. And then I spend the rest of the book looking at the non-word things that do change people's political beliefs.
So we'll come to them, but
yeah.
You said it doesn't work. I mean, in a way, the book suggests that it's worse than that. It actually, in a sense, hardens your views.
Mm-hmm, sometimes.
So that, if you're confronted with something that challenges your views in this abstract sense, you're not likely to be changed, your mind to be changed by it, but your mind to be stuck firmer where you were. Am I overstating this?
I think so this is one of the findings in cognitive dissonance theory. And I did my PhD on cognitive dissonance theory and critical theory combined, which was a PhD no one wanted. The psychology department did not want Marxists, and the political theory department did not want cognitive psychology. But in any case, some of the research on cognitive dissonance theory, which is a theory that suggests that when people notice, even unconsciously, a contradiction between two or more of their beliefs or actions, they tend to engage in some basically quite interesting mental gymnastics. So they will usually try to reconcile that gap because it's uncomfortable. It causes us kind of discomfort that our actions and our beliefs are not aligned. And often we end up finding clever rationalizations or ways to dismiss the source of the evidence so that we can continue to believe what we already believed, because that's much easier for us. It's much easier for us sociologically. We don't have to get a new group of friends. It's much easier in terms of our actions. Our actions are very important, and they're very hard to change for structural reasons, and so on. And some research in cognitive dissonance, this is a bit disputed, but some of it suggests that people actually do harden their beliefs further. I wouldn't say that's the strongest bit of the cognitive dissonance research, but I think more importantly, one of the things I think is increasingly concerning about using words for politics and not any of the other important mechanisms is that it makes it seem like things are fair when they are not fair, right? And in particular, if you think about the logic of the marketplace of ideas, I want to zoom out for a minute and do some political theory. If we assume that the marketplace of ideas is basically a good and just, mysteriously some sort of capitalist system where the best products will just win in the same way that, I don't know, the best like disk drives did back in the 90s and the best whatever we're doing now with computers win today, if we think these are products and we can just pick the best product, then the logical result is that the ideas right now that we have currently are the best ideas. Do we think that? Really? You think that Nigel Farage has the best ideas? I don't think that. And I think most people in this room, probably judging by the, feeling of this event, probably also, maybe some of you are shy reform voters, I don't know. But, even if you are, you probably don't think the best ideas have always historically won, especially not in the short run. And that's kind of what the logic of the marketplace of ideas is. And at the same time, many of us are really bought into this for reasons I can get into if you want. And so we say, oh, well, there's been a debate, people have voted, that's fair. And it really makes our concept of what fairness and what democracy are incredibly thin and fragile. One of the things I point out in the book is that, we don't have this thin standard for many other things. You wouldn't say to me, oh, well, if you went and sort of had a nice little argument with your spouse and then came to an agreement, then you've done a good job of being a spouse or a family member or worked in the office. We wouldn't say, oh, you've exchanged some words and then some kind of agreement was reached. Well, no problem. No, we know that there is this much deeper way that you have to be embodied in a family. You have to show up for people. You have to take care of them. You have to care even when you disagree. There are material concerns that have to be met. Politics is the same. It's much more in a way like being in a family, especially if you're going to be effective, than it is, shooting a couple of tweets out over the internet over time.
And you also suggest, you characterize debate as a type of warfare and suggest that there's really something sort of quite sinister and dominating about the way debate is framed. And I was thinking that this presumably is what Charlie Kirk's form of debating was, which is, I will debate really strongly with you. We can disagree a lot, and that's free speech and that's democracy in action. But you really challenge that way
Well,
of
yeah.
thinking.
First of all, let's talk about Kirk as he actually was, rather than how he's been lionized after his death. Kirk was not engaging in free speech. He had a whole bit of his nonprofit that was dedicated to harassing left-wing professors and getting them fired. He, had a whole bunch of very explicitly racist people in his organization who especially harassed people of color. So he was not, in fact, the free speech paragon he portrayed himself to be. And I think we have to be really immediately attentive to that, because one of the very first signs that someone has pulled an ideological move on people is that the thing they're actually preaching is not the thing that they're doing. And he was not doing that. It is true that he sat under, an umbrella, whatever, cover and told people, debate me. And then he gave them a bunch of sassy, sometimes racist replies. But that's firstly not a particularly good version of debate. Secondly, debate not particularly effective. And thirdly, he did many other things that were much more suppressive of free speech and created a chilling effect on campuses. And I am honestly astonished and dismayed and alarmed that someone like Ezra Klein, who does not always share my politics, but is usually a thoughtful, reasonable person who has done his research, seems to have, for example, written a weird little article in the New York Times saying, oh, he did it right. No, he didn't. You could have Googled this for 3 minutes. 3 minutes. You just had to Google it, Ezra. I don't mean this to be, I'm not trying to become like a firebrand. I just actually think that the ideology of debate as democracy is so strong that people didn't even fact check the guy. Do you know what I mean? They said, oh, he's debating, that's great, that's democracy. Either that or they are opportunists in an increasingly right-wing world. I don't know which, but I am honestly shocked. And then secondly, let's choose someone who is less hypocritical and manipulative than Charlie Kirk. I'm sorry that I can't speak well of the dead, but we need better dead, I think. Frankly. Then let's think about someone who really is trying earnestly to debate. And there are many, right? This is a more serious consideration, in my opinion, because there are many people who are genuinely trying to change the world by debating each other far more earnestly. And the problem in that case is whether that actually works, right? Whether it will instead create the appearance of legitimacy for systems that actually function a different way. And let's just point at American democracy for a minute, since we're stuck there with Charlie Kirk. There's another study at Princeton. Princeton does a lot of these studies. We should figure out where their funders are. They did a study looking just at whether politicians at the federal level, if their policy objectives track with the concerns of the Americans in general, or just the top 5%. And the answer was just the top 5%. Pretty much, if you want to predict what an American congressperson or senator is going to do, they will do whatever the top 5% think is important and want them to do, and the rest of the opinions of the other, this is in terms of wealth and income, the rest of the population do not matter, right? So the appearance of debate makes it seem like we have a really meaningful democracy, but we don't. We don't, and in this country, it's just a little bit less bad because you have slightly better, regulations on how much money can be donated to campaigns. But we're in trouble here also, and we're especially in trouble if you look at the polls lately. So yeah, I'm not sure. I guess what I'm saying is, I think debate is dangerous precisely because of what it doesn't do while providing the appearance that it does.
And so, going back to my framing of the beginning,
Yeah.
would you advise the leader of a new political party, say Zara Sultana, to just
Sure.
drop out of an invitation to a leaders' debate? Maybe justifying it on the basis that it doesn't actually have a healthy airing of views, but privileges the dominant position. Is that the advice you'd give?
I mean, I think that the important thing isn't so much whether you go to the debate or not. I am kind of vaguely concerned about this debate dropping trend. And we're seeing one, by the way. Historically, over the last 10 or 15 years, we're seeing way more debate dodgers, so people who just don't show up on both right and left. But I think the main thing is that that's not always a great use of energy. And one of the things I enjoyed, by the way, is in researching, I want to have some American examples, some UK examples. So I looked at what happens when prime minister's question time rolls around. And the answer for any prime minister of the UK in recent history is they lose their mind. They hate it so much. If you look at the autobiographies of all the recent prime ministers, they just hate it because it's so much energy, right? And poor Rishi Sunak, I hate to say that phrase, but poor Rishi Sunak apparently sweated it so much that he had one of his interns always pretend to be Keir Starmer in the preparation process. And I also feel sad for that intern. I mean, the whole thing is a nightmare. But look, it's a lot of energy. And sometimes that's worth doing because you ultimately do have to get people to the polls, and maybe if basically the evidence about debate is you sometimes have to show up, or otherwise the people that were anyway planning to vote for you become demotivated, but you are not going to change even the undecided's mind. So the question is, what's the goal, right? But yes, I would not start a political party by suggesting that debates are the big thing. Honestly, in my opinion, the answer is go and do some goddamn community organizing, right? Look at the campaigns that have done well recently, whether or not we agree with all of their mechanisms. Mamdani, for example, right? He has done well, not necessarily because he always has great policy solutions. I think some of his policy solutions can be cooked, another round, but because he's concerned about the number one thing that people in New York are concerned about, which is why is everything so unbelievably expensive, right? It's really expensive to live in New York City. He has solutions. Are they the best solutions? We can debate that, but he actually has completely put his finger on what they're worried about, and he has done a bunch of things that might actually help with that. And he's also done a bunch of we're all going to go on the street and we're going to do what did he have? He had a treasure hunt recently. He had a walk through New York. I mean, these things to me are a much more effective way of showing people that you care about the issue that they care about and you are committed to action. And I think especially now that people have such high bullshit filters because they've seen a lot of nonsense, right? They know anyone can pull a fast one on them. A lot of people are very skeptical, and if you actually put your body where the struggle is, in some ways you're more likely to bring people around. And then also we know that community organizing in general tends to move people over time because, as we'll get to, it involves both relationships and actions. So if I was going to start a political party, one I genuinely believed in, I would start there and, fine, debate someone the day before the election, but do all the other stuff first.
Well, yeah, we'll come on more to community organising because that's dear to my heart. But another thing that I like the idea of a lot, I've not really been involved in it much, but I like the idea of it, is citizens' assemblies, deliberative democracy. Now, as your tone of your reaction
I know, everyone
suggested,
likes this.
and this is a little bit more surprising to me, that you're not a great fan of deliberative democracy either, or not as it's where it's being tried. The example you give is the Grand Débat in Macron's France.
Yeah, I mean, again, this one is it's kind of like a different bit of the same thing I've been talking about, where looking at the different reports on it, there were lots of problems with the way it was set up, right? So in general, the people that showed up were older, richer. People's minds were not changed very much.
Can you just explain when this was?
Oh
happened?
yes, sorry. So this was, I mean, I actually cannot remember the exact year. This is my own book, sorry, but it was, some 5 or 6 years ago. Is that true? I don't know. Someone French in the audience correct us. But and he set up this sort of long form, theoretically, like we're going to debate each other in local town halls about the key issues, especially related to these budgetary reforms I want to do. Basically, a process of neoliberalism. And first of all, I think it's important to see that a lot of that was a sort of posturing to avoid what was actually already happening, which was the Yellow Jacket protests against his reforms, right? So he was saying, "Oh no, don't protest me in the street. Don't do what the French people often do admirably, which is burn things to the ground when things become unbearable. But instead, let's have a debate in the town hall." And honestly, although I am very concerned about loss of human life, I think actually destruction of property is a perfectly fine response to certain problems, including the fact that the rich are, taking the huge sums of profit from companies, right? So I think the Gilets jaunes were not necessarily having the wrong response, and his gesturing towards debate was a deflection in some ways. I'm being honest here. The second problem was that even if it was going to be a good mechanism for democratic things in theory, even if there was a potentially good outcome there in some ways, that's not how it actually happened. In general, the people that went to these sort of state-organized debates were older and richer because, let's be real, who has time to go to state-organized debates in the town hall? Usually people that have fancy mortgages and would like to maintain their position. And then I could go on and on about all the different things that functionally didn't work about that process. But I think one of the main things that's interesting to point out there isn't whether or not that ended up being any use to anyone except maybe Emmanuel Macron and probably not even him, but rather that was a useful rhetorical move for him because, especially in France, but also in other countries, debate is still so highly valued. It's still so much held as synonymous with democracy, even though it doesn't necessarily reflect anything about many of the things I would consider to be important in democracies, right? So relatively egalitarian power structures, relatively egalitarian wealth structures, people's preferences actually translating to policies that are put in place based on their preferences, checks and balances on power, right? Debate doesn't have that much to do with any of those things in practice, even though we intuit that it does. So yeah, I don't think I would start there. I don't think it's that effective. I think there are some interesting things about deliberative democracy. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I do want to step back because I think there's something in what you're asking me that is broader about this book, and I don't want to seem too spiky and hedgehoggy here, which is to say that this is a book for people that are like me in the sense that I too, and I mean this really lovingly, like a lot of people, I'm a disillusioned liberal. I went to both Obama inaugurations, and I was delighted to be there at the time, and I have much more complicated feelings about it since, but I'm not here to say, how dare anyone have the fantasy that words could change the world? Because I'm a writer, first of all, right? What I do want to say, though, is that many ideologies have kind of their problems and their beautiful aspects at the same time. And one of the core things to do in a world where we really see the human consequences of these ideologies is to refine them and to keep the bits that are valuable and to sublate, to use a fancy word, the bits that don't work. And I make the argument in this book that liberalism is such a philosophy. There are parts of it that are incredibly beautiful. The idea that there are individual rights at all is a lovely thought. The idea that we recognize individuals as important, separate from what the state wants to do with an individual or what a religion wants to do with an individual is very important. But also, historically, culturally, liberalism has come with all of its contradictions from its kind of founding stuff early in the 16th century onward, you could go way back even, 17th century. It has come with a huge history of slavery and colonialism, of course, but also, a lot of just internal contradictions about, well, if individual rights are also property rights, then what we actually end up with is rich people getting richer and poor people getting poorer, and then eventually the rich people buy the state, and then you don't have your individual rights anymore. And so I could go on and on, but I guess the point is, I'm not here to say don't love these ideas or don't love words or even don't like discussing politics with your neighbor, but I am here to say I love these ideas so much, but the only way to love these ideas right is to live them in the world. It's not enough to just discuss them with people. That might kind of scratch an itch for a moment, but it's not the underlying philosophically important thing, and it won't realize the kind of world I want to see. And so that's why when I look at something like deliberative democracy, I'm not saying, I'm super liberal and let's just do a dictatorship. No, I'm saying the only way to avoid having dictatorship in the long run is to do a lot more than just deliberate.
So We're going to move on to the do's now.
Yeah, let's do the do's.
You've already hinted at them.
We have.
And a lot of it's around actions. And one of the things I wanted to say about this book, what I really liked about it was that it's very solutions focused. Some of the solutions are not easy to implement. But you didn't write a book, which so many books of these type do, which just says it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. What are we going to do about it? I haven't got any idea. You have some ideas. And we'll get on to those ideas. But one of the things you hinted at there with the discussion of France was the Gilets jaunes. A form of action that isn't about words is protest.
Yeah.
Now, I think I'd suggest a slightly ambivalent feeling about protest, that, going out and marching or taking direct action is worthwhile. But again, it doesn't necessarily change minds, but it does change something. What does it change?
Yes. Okay, so now that I've probably, upset this portion of the political spectrum, now we can upset some left-wing people. Obviously I sort of looked at the data on, does the marketplace of ideas change people's minds? Do debate change people's minds? No, empirically in both cases for the most part. And then I looked at protest. And remarkably, protest in one specific sense, the one that people most commonly think of usually when they're in this room, so basically non-violent demonstrations that don't, block roads for very long anyway, and don't keep anything else hostage, as I would say. Those protests, do they have an effect on public opinion, and do they have an effect on government policy? And the answer in that specific case is no. In the long run, we do not see changes related to protests of that kind, either in terms of what the government does, which makes sense. I would say that's the most obvious one, because the government already had a plan that was to their benefit, and they're going to do it unless someone really gets in their way, and a bunch of protesters outside their building is a mere annoyance. And also public opinion doesn't change. Perhaps that's a bit more surprising, but one of the examples I give in the book is the Black Lives Matter protest. The Black Lives Matter protest was the largest ever demonstration protest in America, for example, and they did change public opinion briefly for about 3 or 4 years, a little bit, so much that actually sociologists were very excited because this was a new finding. Wow, we found a protest movement and it's actually moving the dial a little bit on public opinion, which is very unusual. So already you can see it's not that common that you see that effect, right? But by now we are back to the baseline. When the protest movement ends, even if it goes on for a long time, generally speaking, public opinion almost always goes back to where it was before. It does not change public opinion. And I can give you lots of explanations for that and whatever, but I want to say that doesn't mean protests, even of that kind, are useless. Because they do one thing. They do change one group of people's minds, and that's the protesters. So then I look at the data on, what happens if somebody with whatever level of political views and opinion joins a protest movement? If you compare two people that have similar political views, but one of them actually joins the protest movement and one doesn't, for often relatively arbitrary reasons like where the protest is. The person who gets pulled into the protest movement is changed for life. Sociologists have a whole category of research they do just about this. What happens to someone who joins a protest movement? And when I give this chat to activists, they start groaning in recognition, because what happens to someone who joins a protest movement is they get divorced more, they have fewer kids, they go back to graduate school, which is a terrible idea, they make less money, they become less religious, and so on and so forth, right? They change for life. And their political views also change for life, which makes sense because they've radically remapped all their relationships and they're doing different actions, and so they are really changed. And so what I say to people that are creating social movements is, yeah, sure, have a demonstration-led protest if you're going to motivate the hell out of people and keep them going, and then recruit them really well into something else where they'll be really useful to you. That's what it's for. It's a recruitment and retention strategy, which is also, by the way, why you have to disrupt the demonstrations of the far right, because they can do that really effectively if you don't.
And so, building on that, you suggest, well, by all means call a march, but afterwards make sure that you go back to the people who came and start this phrase, community organising.
Yeah, it's a good approximation of what I'm discussing.
And
anyway.
so much of what is very compelling about your book is the idea that actions actually form ideas, and in a sense, actions precede ideas, which turns on its head most of the ways we thought about these things. Can you explain some examples of that?
Sure. I'll start philosophically to be annoying but maybe useful. So one of the things I think, to go back to the marketplace of ideas analogy, one of the things I think is wrong with this marketplace of ideas analogy, as beautiful as it sounds on paper, in addition to the fact that I don't believe the Trump administration embodies the best ideas, is that ideas are not really commodities. They're not like little items that we can kind of consider a little bit and then, this one's good, I'll take it. And they're especially not that when they are political ideas. If you think about the political ideas that you hold most dear, you don't really have those ideas. They're not like in a little basket at your feet. They have you. Let me think about feminism for a minute, right? I was raised with feminism, then I became even more feminist. Now I'm like off the Overton chart somewhere over here, doing weird gender theory. Okay, but these ideas have me. They change the way I do all of my relationships, platonic and otherwise. They change the way I dress, the way I think, the way I react to things on the internet. They have me, they have me. I don't mean that I can't think for myself at all, but they have shaped the kind of person I am and the way I engage in the world. And that is so much more involved and messy and sticky and involved in my day-to-day actions than like a commodity I could pick up. You know, it's not another handbag or something. Okay, so remind me, where are we going with this?
This is the business of action.
Yeah, action. So why do our actions matter? Well, they partially matter because of this, right? Because actually an idea becomes real when we start doing it. But also just to get into empirical data again, people love this. It kind of lets them, you know, most of the evidence suggests that people change their views over time only when their actions change. Only when their own actions change. If you think about the cognitive dissonance paradigm, the problem is that you have like an action you're going on, like an expensive flight somewhere, and then you have your dissonance about it, which is, but this is terrible for the planet. And most people are pretty bought into whatever flight they're going to go on because, you know, oh, but I've got to go to like so-and-so's wedding, or, well, this is really important for work, or whatever. And then they find a way to rationalize themselves and they keep doing the action. But more broadly, if you look at people's smaller actions politically, there used to be a debate about this in sociology, and it was called the gateway debate. Are small political actions, like signing a petition, recycling, whatever, are these relatively innocuous actions the way that people offload their guilt, or do they tend to get more involved in that movement over time? This is a good question, by the way. And they spend a lot of time doing different studies trying to figure it out. And obviously it can go both ways. There are some people who just use these small actions as a getaway, but on average, the data suggests that people become more and more interested in that movement. Probably because as they change even small actions, their cognitive dissonance can get reconciled in new ways. They say, I actually went on one fewer flight, and now I feel more strongly about climate change, and I can, because I actually didn't go on that flight, and now I can think differently about it, right? And I ate a little bit less meat, and then I thought more about animal rights, and so on and so forth. So the actions serve more as gateways. The actions change our mind. And I think this is really important because it asks us to question what it means to think about politics well. Right now, the image of the good political thinker is still, I think, kind of like, you know, that guy in the statue, the Rodin statue, right? Alone by himself, pondering things, possibly in his room. It is interesting that he's a man, and he's on his own. But if you look at the cases where people think in profound ways about politics, firstly, they're not on their own. They're in a movement with other people, trying out different things, trying out ideas for size. And secondly, they're doing stuff. And as they do stuff, they find new solutions, they encounter new barriers, they discover the police really are corrupt or whatever else is happening to them. They refine their understanding of the idea through action, and they become more committed, and they help each other, right? If you think about consciousness-raising movements in the 70s, both for black people and women, for example, people needed to think together to understand something like sexual harassment. So people need both the relationships and the actions, and only by doing a combination of those do they slowly change their mind in very profound ways about politics. And so my image of the good political thinker is the women making the sandwiches right before the Million Man March for the Civil Rights Movement. These were women that were mostly women who were, just for that bit of the movement, who were deeply bought into the movement. They met very regularly, much more regularly than a lot of protest movements meet today. They lived in a network of like stores and churches and other economic structures that meant they saw each other regularly. They often only bought from black-owned stores. They had all kinds of other things built into their life about that movement. And then they did lots of work that was not particularly glamorous, but was really important, like deciding that no mayonnaise could be on the sandwiches for the Million Man March because people would get food poisoning, right? And they're great political thinkers. We should have statues to them.
So going back again, I'm sticking to this.
Yeah, why action?
Your advice to the new political party.
Sure.
You use the phrase, what we need to do is rebuild high-density parties. What do you mean by that?
High involvement and high demand. I think I used the word demand, but I could be wrong. Yes, right now a lot of people's image of like, what does it mean to be politically involved? Oh, it means I think about politics a lot with my friends at the dinner party, and maybe I've signed some petitions and I've read a lot. I've read so much. I am tired of reading. I do a lot of it anyway, don't worry. But, you know, political parties similarly tend to think, oh, you know what our members are? Our members are there to get honestly quite creepy emails from us on a regular basis about fundraising. Yeah. You know? Their idea, and actually I think it's important for us to historicize that. So one of the things that political scientists write about a lot is this shift from membership-based associations, as they often were, at least in America, but I think also here to a significant degree in the 40s and 50s. People were members. They paid dues, obviously, but they also showed up to meetings, debated things with each other there, and then built relationships relationships with each other, which is the thing that actually changes their mind, did actions in the community, supported each other through various things. And then there was a shift. Theda Skocpol is one of the people who writes about this. As NGOs became very popular, non-profits, as we say in the States, where suddenly you had kind of advocacy bodies, but they weren't really membership-based. They just got like a bunch of fancy funding from, again, the top 5%, to think through a problem, and they didn't necessarily involve all these other people anymore. And so they weren't asking that much of people, including they weren't asking them that much for their actions. And political parties have gone through this transformation as well, especially as unions have been taken apart in the States, and also, frankly, as religion has declined as well, because religion is a high participation activity, and some of that was politicized as well. Right now, one of the most highly politicized action-based groups in the United States are evangelical Christians and the far right. They're doing a lot of actions. They're asked to do stuff on a regular basis. Go out and find 2 friends and bring them to this thing. Go out and do this. We're gonna have a food bank, etc. But a lot of political parties, I mean, what have you been asked by a major political party recently? I'm basically only ever asked for money. Very occasionally, right before the election, they panic and they ask you to go door knock. That's it. We could do so much more.
We're coming towards when we open it up for questions, but I just wanted to say one of the things that really struck me about this book was that you're quite positive about Twitter.
I wouldn't say that, but...
Well, I'm just going to qualify it.
Sure.
Early Twitter, you made me quite nostalgic for early Twitter. There is something about that, and there's a serious point behind this, because what you're saying is that Twitter is part of what you call the infrastructure that we need in order to have better debates, or at least it was in its earlier iterations.
Yeah, I think to kind of refine that point a little bit, I don't think Twitter, and there's studies in this, by the way, I don't think Twitter ever changed people's minds in itself. I think it did serve other really interesting functions. In particular, for various minority groups, it seemed to have been a lot of the way that they found each other online, which is incredibly important. It was also fun to be on. I miss Fun Twitter. Fun Twitter is long gone now. But there was a moment where you could get on Twitter and there'd be sort of like one really great hot take, like one really interesting news article curated for you by someone who wasn't nuts, and then a great cat picture, and then you'd go have your coffee. And I miss that. And I'd also learn about all kinds of bubbles. Twitter was particularly good because it didn't have. We were actually talking about this backstage, but Reddit, you kind of go on Reddit mostly looking for a specific thing. At least many users function that way. They go looking, why is the oat milk doing this weird curdling? And then they find the Reddit for oat milk aficionados or whatever. But Twitter was almost, of course there was an algorithm, but you could stumble upon subcultures. You could have interesting context collapse all the time, and I miss that, and I miss the playfulness of it. I don't think it served as a good public sphere because, again, I think very good public spheres. I want to reference one more bit of sociology, and then I'll shut up about sociology potentially. But one of the things I talk about in the book is the conditions under which sociologists find people to get less prejudiced. It's called social contact theory, and there are lots of interesting things that have to be present for people to become less prejudiced against each other. But there are a couple that are not present on the internet pretty much at all. One of them is shared goals. People on the internet running into each other on social media don't have shared goals generally. So they are not in a psychological position, it seems, to do this important work of becoming less prejudiced. And even on Twitter, I think that was true. So I'm not up on Twitter as a alternative to debate. I just think there were charming, interesting bits of it. But the other thing about Twitter that's important to notice is when Twitter was bought by Elon Musk, a lot of people were really upset about it. And I want to interrogate that. Why were we so upset? I'll align myself with all the sad people about Twitter. Why? Because I think for many, there was a fantasy, and it was a fantasy because Twitter was always a privately owned thing that interestingly was built by guys who were actually not trying to create a public sphere at all originally. It was like for coders, and most of the useful functions of Twitter happened by accident when users discovered that you could use the @ signal. It was not meant for that. But in any case, we were nostalgic because we imagined onto it this magical agora world where we could have these great conversations. It wasn't really doing that, but it felt like a piece of important democratic infrastructure, and it certainly was more that than it is now. And when it was purchased, it kind of reminded people, because they hated Elon Musk so much and he was being so weird, that actually most of our public infrastructure for discussion at all is owned by billionaires. Most of it. Almost anything you read, most newspapers, most TV stations are owned by billionaires, all the social media platforms pretty much, right? Most of the infrastructure through which we communicate, through which we could reasonably organize even, is owned by big corporations and often by just like a guy. And sometimes that guy is Elon Musk. And I think the story of Twitter kind of shows us all the contradictions in our consciousness about, I really want there to be a public sphere and I want the marketplace of ideas to work, but I know it doesn't because now I have to see Elon Musk's tweets every day, but I still want this thing. And what can I do instead?
Well, we barely scratched the surface of this book. There's loads more in here, despite what a rich contribution you've made already. But let's turn it open to questions. We'll take them one at a time. If you could put your hand up and a microphone will come to you quickly. So who's going to be the first person? There's a guy in the front row here with the blue check shirt.
Okay.
If you could just say your name and if it's relevant, your organisation.
Hi, I'm George. I actually do quite a lot with the Labour Party as a volunteer.
Great.
So do some of the organising. I thought it was interesting at the beginning what you were saying about it's difficult to change people's minds. I think you used the example of gay marriage. And obviously we have seen the views of gay marriage in especially the UK change massively over the last 20 years. What do you think then caused that change?
It doesn't really matter what I think on my own, but the good news is there's loads of research about this. And this is a perfect example, actually, of one of the points I'm trying to make in this book, which is that people were given arguments for decades and decades and decades about gay marriage, and it was unbelievably unpopular until very recently, by the way. I mean, if you look at like polls in the early noughties, most people would say, no, that's gross, behind closed doors, et cetera, at best, right? And then what appears to have happened is there was essentially just enough of momentum that people started coming out to their friends. And one of the things I argue in this book is that, okay, again, the two things that change people's views on politics, changes in their network of relationships and changes in their own actions and experiences. And this changed the first one. People had the same friends as before, generally, but they suddenly knew that that friend was gay or whatever else, but usually, you know. And that appears to have had a huge effect. So they could actually track what happened when people's friends came out to them, and they could see, okay, what's changed this person's mind is not that someone presented them with a brilliant argument, it's that it humanized Fred, you know, and they said, well, I don't think being gay is good, but now I really like Fred, and what do I do? And interestingly, most of the time, not all the time, of course, unfortunately, many people said, actually, I'm going to reconcile my dissonance a different way, because relationships have a very strong pull on us. They're so important to human beings that in some cases, for once, we don't rationalize away the argument anymore. We say, actually, I'm going to change my mind.
And interestingly, you give some examples of where, as it were, governments can get out ahead of public opinion and, as it were, do the right thing.
How so?
Well, I was thinking of the San Francisco plastic water
Oh yeah,
bottle
should we talk
ban.
about this study? I mean, it's a little bit authoritarian, but I think it's very interesting. So there are two very interesting studies run by the same group of researchers who I got to interview, which was very exciting, and they're lovely people. But that's not the point. The point is they wanted to understand what happens when new policies come into effect. And by the way, the results are mixed. So sometimes a new policy comes into effect that people don't really like, and people respond badly, and they say, we really hate this. If you haven't heard about what's happening with like 15-minute cities, people have lost their minds in certain respects. Okay, but then sometimes you pass a policy and suddenly everyone's on board with it. And they wanted to understand the difference. And the difference appears to be that if it seems like this policy is not going to be rolled back, it is not negotiable, and it's a change in your life that's going to happen soon, and you're going to have to do an action in response to it. I'll give you two examples. One was bans on smoking in public places in Ontario. They did a study there where they saw huge belief shifts. And the other one was in San Francisco, where there was a ban on plastic water bottles. And in both cases, for various reasons, those bans seemed pretty definite, like they were definitely going to be in place for a while, and people's behaviors would obviously have to shift, right? And what they saw is that they could go back and ask the same people who didn't like the ban just the day after that ban was passed. And many of those exact same people would say, actually, this is fine. Right? They say, it's fine. I never smoke that much in public places anyway, and you know, it's good to have these reusable water bottles, and it's good. I like it, actually. And often they didn't even remember that they had disliked it before. And this is the other lever, it's the actions. It's that you're going to have to go out and not buy a plastic water bottle, and you live with the dissonance, and you say, I'll just get on board. Of course, this could go any way morally. I don't care whether San Franciscans should probably not buy plastic water bottles, and I don't smoke, so I don't really care about these two examples of authoritarianism. But I think they're very indicative of how a lot of other authoritarian movements work, right? Which is they say, you have no choice, get on board, these are your actions tomorrow, and people do, because that's psychologically how we function. So, yeah.
Another question, the guy here with the glasses.
G'day, hi.
Hi.
My name's Jack. My question's around converting or affecting people who have moved over to the far right. So I'm someone who has a half-decent social media following. I'm quite concerned about the movement towards the right politics, both in my own country and in the US.
They're winning. They're winning there especially.
From reading your book, I can see how reaching, I imagine most of my followers are left-leaning liberals, potentially disillusioned. I can see how taking the advice even you mentioned here on board, where getting them to do actions, forming some sort of community, actually doing things can move them further to the left, or at least make them more active and more likely to vote and affect elections. Do you have any advice as to how to reach those who are, let's say, algorithmically isolated? Because it seems to me that a lot of the movement to far right and the surge in popularity is that lots of young men and people from all demographics are being essentially propagandized to, perhaps ostensibly under debate content, and are being radicalized that way. And prior to reading your book, I would have said, well, I think debates are important because that's one of the ways you can actually reach into those algorithmic echo chambers and actually get them to see another point of view. So do you have any advice as to how we could reach them if debate is not an effective way?
That's such a great question. This is where I'm going to model myself thinking through this problem rather than smugly tell you I have an answer, because I don't think we, the collective people concerned about the far right, have an answer yet. And it would be disingenuous to pretend we do. Otherwise, we'd be winning more. I want to say just to, I want to give two kind of like flags for people that don't think about this problem all day. I do also. Why this is important. Firstly, this is the year that people have watched more short form video content online than they have watched real TV in the world. So if you look at people's media consumption, we watch more Reels, TikTok, and YouTube basically hours-wise as a human population than we do normal television. So this stuff is hugely consumed. And the other bit of information that's important to know is that it is also very much leaning right most of the time for reasons that are not fully understood, frankly. Like, I could be conspiracist about it, but I don't think it's that simple. One of the studies they did recently, they just did this with the German political parties. They got like 5 phones and they created 5 TikTok accounts and they followed the 5 major political parties in Germany, and they just went and only liked things from those political parties that they were affiliated with, and then they waited to see what the TikTok algorithm would serve them. And the answer for the 4 phones that were not supposed to be fans of the far-right party was still 75% far-right content. And we don't really know why. I mean, it might be that the Chinese government behind the scenes is going, ha ha ha, that's possible. It's also possible that the far right is really good at making this content. They're very good. I mean, algorithms respond to very specific things about shareability and hooks, and this is actually what I do for my day job a lot of the time is content strategy, so maybe they're really good at that. Maybe this is one of my main theories. I think they're very good at generating anger, and they build their narratives off of anger, and anger is great for the algorithm, so there's also that. I mean, there are a lot of reasons. Huge problem. Okay, so what do we do? I mean, I think one of the main things, we didn't even really get to this in the book. One of my chapters is on social atrophy. And social atrophy is a psychological phenomenon, first of all, that is measurable in large population studies where people who are socially isolated over time, their brain changes in terms of both self-reported effects, and also you can see it in the MRI machine. And if anyone in the audience is a nerd enough to say, MRIs are not reliable, you're right for most things. They're not reliable for electronic studies, but they're perfectly reliable for is the brain in there and what size is it? And that's what's being measured. And people's brains shrink when they're socially isolated, and also they become more paranoid. I could get into the details of that, but the short version is those changes happen because the way you use your brain is the way it strengthens itself, and the way you don't use it, you lose that ability. So we lose our social abilities, and we strengthen basically our paranoid systems, which I think the far right thrives off of. And so I would see this problem fundamentally as, yes, we should probably be on TikTok doing something sometimes because it's absolutely nuts that 75% of the content is often far right. But we also, maybe more importantly, need to get the people we're concerned about in physical spaces with other people where much more profound relationships can be built. This is why the other day I made a reel about gyms, right? Because that's where a lot of these young men who are, or older men who are quite isolated often go, is one of the physical spaces where they are. And actually I have seen some limited but very interesting activism that's just about men who are not that, going to the gyms and being like, we're going to make this space not a place where the far right can recruit, and we're going to have alternative messages, and we're going to talk to people and build relationships and take people to the pub afterward. And I think that work is very important. And actually, in a surprise turn for my career, I'm going on a Brazilian jiu-jitsu podcast next month to talk about this problem. So I guess my theory is occupy online space a bit, occupy offline space a lot, and find the people that are experiencing social atrophy. And we all are, by the way. Most of the data, to some degree, most of the data that we see about large-scale studies of Americans, for example, and Americans actually have the best data on this, is that people spend about 45% more time alone than they did about 10 years ago. And that's really bad for our brains, but it's also, to be a nerd about this specifically, really bad for certain kinds of democratic things, especially tolerance for minorities and other people. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Lady here in the white jumper.
Hi,
Hello.
thank you for the discussion, really interesting. My name is Lizzie, I come from a mental health and psychology background, and my question, and you touched on that already a little bit, is I suppose the difference between fluoride and politics is that we identify, and our identity is a lot more shaped by our political opinions than about our opinions on fluoride. So my question is, how can we, what kind of initiatives can we take in educational and therapeutic settings that could allow us to perhaps divorce our political opinions from our identity?
I don't know if that's the move, because I don't think it's intellectually honest. You know, like, there's a reason that people's identities are tied to their politics. Politics, I mean, I'll use some science first, and then we can kind of theorize. But one of the things that people discovered when cognitive dissonance theory was created in the 50s, starting with studies on cults, is that you don't have cognitive dissonance about everything. Again, it's the thing with the fluoride, right? You just have it on some things. And we know this because a whole bunch of other angry scientists got upset because this didn't help with their research, so they tried to disprove cognitive dissonance theory, and they found they could only really disprove it about things like fluoride. And eventually they came up with a set of conditions under which cognitive dissonance theory falls. So people experience cognitive dissonance when they encounter contradictions between their beliefs or actions, but only when, and then it basically said, when it seems like it affects their sense of agency, their sense of identity as good people, or basically the sense that if a bad thing happened, they didn't cause it, and if a good thing happened, they, in some way, you know, were in support of it, right? It's about our sense of ourselves as causing good in the world. And if that's our identity, I mean, I don't really want to divorce people from their sense of themselves as good moral agents, because I want them to think about that all the time. If there's a broader question, I think the broader question, or maybe a good way of refining this is, okay, politics is always going to be about our identity. Our lives are political. One of the things I talk about at the end of this book is I really think it's a fantasy, this idea that there could be a sphere outside of politics. I think it's an understandable desire, given that most people associate politics with all the worst bits of debate culture, with the angry people on the internet. And look, I really get it, because right now I have 25,000 Instagram followers, and I have like 500 white men trolls in my comments telling me nasty things. So I understand why people want to imagine there's a world without politics, but it is a fantasy. We're living in a world that is rapidly heating and where wealth has been massively distributed upward. And those are just two examples. There is no world where we can escape that. We live in a political world. I think the important question is rather, how can we live in a world where when we encounter new ideas, we actually can change our minds? That's, I think, the really important question. And the answer to that question, in my view, is that you have to go out and be engaged in the world enough that you form very diverse groups of relationships with lots of different kinds of people, where you kind of make for your life the set of conditions in those sociological studies where you have groups of people where you're different from them, but you have shared goals, right? Where you're living inside of social infrastructures where you can have those kinds of democratic, basically, relationships of equals. And then you get to meet people who are different from yourself, so you're going to be at minimum less racist, less prejudiced in general. I think that's very important. And then I think the other thing is about enabling people to try out new actions in the world. And a lot of that, frankly, it's not the only thing, but a lot of that is about income inequality. One of the things I was particularly struck by as I dug into this research is just how much people in my generation do less than their parents. They go out less, they see other people less, they're in fewer clubs, they start businesses less, they move less, and when they do move, they move away from city centers and away from other people. People just have fewer actions in their lives that could potentially change their views or broaden their minds. As their lives shrink, honestly, their political considerations shrink too. So, to go back to this mental health thing, the good news is most of the things that are relatively good for people's mental health look like this. They're still political, but they're just not yelling at people on the internet. They're being in communities with other people, learning to navigate difference, strengthening their social skills, and trying out stuff in the world. And more or less, that is really good for people's mental health. In fact, one of the last bits of my book, like pep talk I give to the reader, using data, my favorite thing, is that they did studies of left-wing people with relatively similar views, because there's been a long controversy about why right-wing people report being happier than left-wing people. And actually, it's not just that they report it, there are different ways of measuring how happy people are, and they do seem to be happier than left-wing people, which sucks for us, sorry. Except for the left-wing people that are engaged in activism, which I realize is really contrary to our sensibility. A lot of people think of activists as like those horrible people that are like policing your language and yelling at each other and breaking into smaller and smaller groups, right? But actually, people engaged in activism on the left are happier than the non-active left-wing people. And that makes sense because they have more relationships and they're more engaged in the stuff they're doing. So I think that's what we have to do. It doesn't all have to be explicitly political, but building those relationships of equals in the community, yeah, let's do it.
Another question. There's one at the back.
Yeah, I'd love to do a person at the back.
My name's Angel. I'm just a student.
Hello.
I would like to ask you about ways of changing the minds of people who actually believe in conspiracy theories or who intake so much misinformation on a daily basis that they just insist that it's a fact. Because the more I listen to them, the more I think that's a psychological problem, that they kind of want to feel that they're so special about knowing some hidden truth about the world which other people don't know. So I just find it incredibly hard, perhaps, to change your views.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in conspiracy theories, so I'm going to give you like a baseline answer. There are probably even smarter ones. We did an interview on conspiracy. So I have, of course, like every person in 2025, a podcast. And last year we did one called What Do We Want, which is based on the activist cheer. What do we want? But it's about the inner lives of activists. And we have a whole episode where we interview a former conspiracist who's escaped, essentially. And he talks a lot about what helped him get into it and what helped him get out of it. And I recommend that. And I recommend his work. His work's really interesting. But from what I understand, you're not wrong. There are some mental health conditions will enable people to potentially believe more in this, but a lot of people who believe in conspiracy theories are not in any identifiable way having this or that mental health thing. And a lot of it does seem to be about two things. One is they are the kind of people who just like having beliefs in general, which I know sounds a little bit weird, but one of the most marked things about this is they often believe contradictory conspiracy theories. So when you do like studies on this, you ask them which conspiracy theories are true. A lot of people will both say that Princess Diana is still alive and that the Queen killed her, which is my favorite, right? And the sort of psychological understanding of that is they just really like having beliefs. They're like, the more beliefs I have, the better. Great. And yeah, so I'm not really sure how to get in there, but it helps me think about that a little bit because I like having beliefs too, right? I just, maybe not quite that hard. And then the other thing I think we're thinking about is that person's social network. Because one of the things I was particularly struck by is that I found this like in a footnote in a paper, but it's one of the most fascinating things I found while researching this book, is that most recruitment into groups, whether you think the groups are good or bad, happens through what are called your strong ties. So your strong ties are your friends, like people you actually know, you already hang out with them anyway, and they say, oh, come to, the Catholic Church, the Green Party, whatever. And okay, great. And then you come and then you convert or you join the Green Party or I don't know, whatever. I mean, it doesn't even have to be political. Then you become fascinated with horseback riding, something, if you have enough money. And okay, most things are strong tie things. But I could go on a rant here about what weak ties are and how great they are, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to say they're also weak ties. Weak ties are your friends of friends. They're people you barely know. Maybe you chat to them on the internet. You don't have that much pull on each other. But for certain groups, especially cults, people are recruited through weak ties primarily rather than strong ties. And the reason for that simply seems to be that the kind of person who gets involved in cults doesn't have a lot of strong ties. So they're relatively able to be pulled into that. And there's some evidence that people who believe in conspiracies it's mixed. People are still trying to figure this out. Are pulled in because they lack strong friendships. And maybe the best thing you can do for that person in some ways is help them have more of those. That said, we're also living through a dark time where there are some conspiracy theories that are so big that they have become strong tie movements. And QAnon is a really great example. So QAnon, I mean, something like 2/3 of Republican voters believe some aspect of the QAnon conspiracy theory. And people don't get recruited into that anymore via their weak ties because they have plenty of friends. They get recruited through their strong ties, and that's scary. But yeah, it's a really interesting question and phenomenon in our age, yeah. Hello.
Hello. That was very interesting, thank you. I wanted to ask about democracy and connection and value, because we've seen a really interesting dynamic emerge in countries like the Netherlands and Germany, where essentially it has become a narrative of the far right against everybody else. And we saw that with Macron as well, when he called an election and it became everybody congregated together to block the rise of the far right. And I wondered what you thought about the kind of dynamic of values and connection as it's becoming quite entrenched on the right, but then within the left and the centre, there's kind of this amalgamation of people coming together over blocking something else and a lack of value. I wondered how we kind of navigate that in the future.
Yeah, this is the constant question on the left, which is do we collaborate with the liberals to get rid of the far right? And I think, even though this is boring and not a hot take, I think the answer is still yes. There are people worth defending, and if we don't do that, we're more likely to lose and more people will be harmed, and so we should do that right now, certainly. Even though many people who say that they're centrists or liberals or whatever will later turn around and, Rosa Luxemburg assassinate us or whatever. Okay, I'm using obscure historical references, I'm sorry. I think so. Like, I think we have to. It's pragmatic. But maybe there's a question about how do we do that? And I would say, like, it's interestingly a question I face right now. One of the weirder interviews I did this year was with a guy called Reed Galen, who is, some of you will know of him, he's the founder of something called the Union, but before that, he was the founder of something called the Lincoln Project, which is a group of about 6 fairly important Republicans who left when Trump came to power and just work against Trump all day and all night. And I am tempted to believe that they have also moved leftward in some of their political views, but look, they are not going to be Marxist sociologists. They're not, right? And yet Reed and I have a very nice, like, pleasant relationship with each other. I'm going to interview him on my platform soon. He's being interviewed by Grace Blakely tonight, right? So there's this, like, kind of, there are these bridge relationships that you have with people that probably disagree with you about economics, but are really passionate about, for example, anti-fascism. And okay, I think that's fine. But I also think that there are a couple of things where you kind of have to continue to articulate the difference. And I don't want to get too niche into this. It's just something I think about a lot. So I really appreciate the question. But one of them is that one of the things I try to do is when people that actually disagree with me think they agree with me, I tell them, you know, you keep agreeing with me, but we disagree. I think it's still important to articulate these differences. And I think that's just a stubborn insistence on truth more than any particular strategic bent. But I've always liked the Terry Eagleton line, which is, it is beneath the dignity of a rational creature not to understand the conditions of their own oppression. So I continue to lay out my left politics because I don't want people to be oppressed and not understand why it's happening. Why is this happening? Lots of it is material. It is about our economy. This economy is not compatible with democracy. And I can work with someone who disagrees with me on that, especially if we're getting rid of a bunch of racists, but I am going to say what I believe. And then I think the second question is, as soon as the right is diminished in any way, and God willing they will be before too long, but I'm not incredibly hopeful, honestly. If that happens, then you have to turn around and be like, cool, we are at best at odds now, and maybe we are enemies, because people do have very significant differences, and that's just reality. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and an anxiety, I think, yeah.
Question there.
There's a guy over here.
Another one at the back.
Another person here as well.
Right.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, okay.
My name is Sunil.
Hi.
And I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts on changing people's mind through an inspiring leadership. I mean, far right could only come in if you give them room. Over the last 15 years, we haven't had great leadership here and in America. So maybe that's what's lacking as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I wanna untangle what it might mean. I do actually think that I agree that there is something there. One of the things I remember back in the day when I had to work for a place that kind of like created like business leadership courses is one of the studies we stumbled upon. They were trying to find commonalities between people that were like pretty effective leaders, even of crazy things like cults. And one of the main things they found is lots of other things didn't matter. Were they extroverted? Nah, sort of mattered, not that much. You know, they measured for all these things. One of the main things was this person like 100% committed and on board with the cause that they were with? And that seemed to matter a lot. And I do think, I think we are actually experiencing a leadership gap in this area in a lot of cases, right? And this is true across the political spectrum. Some of the least, frankly, sorry, I'm going to trash Keir Starmer, apologies to the very nice man in the Labour Party. You know, like there are people who, I don't know what they believe behind closed doors, but I cannot tell when they leave those closed doors either, right? There are people who at least cannot demonstrate that they have like convicted beliefs that they are seriously behind. And I will say, even in my own context, I hopefully will never run for office for anything ever in my life. Unfortunately, that's not what the public wants anyway. But even when you write, I find that people actually are very attracted to someone who is totally honestly themselves, a weirdo on the page, uncompromising, interesting, right? That's actually really interesting to people. And I worry that because people's understanding of democracy is so based culturally on the idea that you should be likable and like find a middle ground. You know, of course, there are lots of things it's worth having a middle ground on. There are also some issues you cannot have a middle ground on. That they miss that actually what people are attracted to is conviction. You know,
Sarah, do you think that we've actually seen this happening on the left with the election of Zach Polanski as the leader of the Green Party? Because presumably you're thinking, well, I mean, I don't know what you think about him. Yeah. But that's an example of going for a more charismatic leader, in fact going to having one leader as opposed to joint leaders. Instead of doing the slow, patient, build-up relational work, it's going to be very tempting, isn't it, on the left to follow that playbook?
Well, firstly, I think that, I mean, look, I'm not going to like tell you Zach Polanski is perfect because he used to believe you could increase your breast size with your mind. But so, and I'm saying this lovingly because, like, I don't think it's good to have heroes. I am fundamentally against having like political heroes. However, I mean, I literally have had green activists knock on my door, right? So I actually think they're doing a reasonable ground game right now. I don't think they are that detached from their community. I do think the reason that he has done reasonably well so far, part of it is that he is pretty convicted, right? Like he is pretty passionate about the things he's passionate about. He's not compromising about them. He's willing to say, like, I'm a left-wing Jew, this is what I feel about Palestine, this is what I feel about the environment. And I do think he has succeeded because he's willing basically to take a stand and stick there. But yeah, I actually think the Green Party has done a lot of work. I think we often don't see it behind the scenes. Incidentally, I believe that's also true about the far right. People often think, oh, they're only online radicalizing these guys, but they're not. One of the things I talk about at the end of the book is how Steve Bannon has a whole playbook that is unfortunately basically the dark version of my book, where he goes and gets people to go out and do the actions and build the relationships. So I guess what I would say is, at minimum, I think there is a leadership gap in two respects. One is actually believing something, and the other is showing up and acting like it. And maybe there's a third thing about strategy. I don't particularly like having political heroes because I've never even had a friend that I thought was particularly perfect, you know? So good luck with your political hero. I mean, come on. And then they're going to get lots of power? Yeah, they're going to behave well, I'm sure. But there are some leadership gaps there about conviction and being willing to take some unpopular positions. And if we could combine that with like a really winning political strategy that had some democratic checks and balances, wouldn't that be beautiful? Maybe one day.
Well, time has whizzed by. We've got time, I think, just for one more question.
Can we take that person's question? Yeah, you. Yeah, the femme-seeming person.
Yeah, but
Great.
He had his hand up for the. Sorry, I'm assuming, but you had your hand up.
I'm just conscious of the gender balance of questions, but
yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I'm also here afterward. I'll come chat to you. Don't worry. I'm going to be here.
So I guess going off what you said earlier about church, Green Party, horseback riding, if you have enough income.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Great.
You know, a lot of people are not religious or do not, maybe they're spiritual, but they don't, have a place they go to regularly.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not involved in politics or to the point where they want to become a member of a party. And then there's the money issue, right? Like social infrastructure, third spaces where people can go where they don't have to pay anything. Like these places are closing.
Totally.
And so I think, you've kind of laid out what it is people can, get offline, but go where, right? Like people come to this.
Great question.
But then come and then talk to you and then maybe leave because they're like, oh, it's awkward, right? Like there's not, the social infrastructure here isn't laid out. And yet this is kind of the audience that you're kind of saying, build relationships with each other.
Yeah.
So, maybe could you talk a little bit more about maybe what you'd like to see or what you have seen, like real, actual things that people like.
Yeah, this is great. This is like, you pitched me the perfect ball and I'm going to thank you. Yeah, this is the right question. This is the question about social infrastructure. That's the sort of nice jargony word for it. It's the places and spaces that we can go to be together with other people who are, again, at best weak ties. They're not like our closest family. One of the nice phrases people have for this is third spaces, and I just want to remind people why they're third spaces. The first space is the home. The home is exclusive. Only certain people can come into my home. I don't know about you. The second space is work. Work is pretty much always hierarchical, right? And also somewhat exclusive. So it's also not democratic in those senses. But third spaces are more or less democratic. And I mean that with the more and the less. But they are technically spaces where nearly everyone could go, often for very little money, ideally in a good third space for almost nothing at all, right? Or nothing. And we are seeing a huge decline in third spaces across the UK and the US. I'm very concerned about this. Honestly, more than a lot of other things people worry about with democracy. And that's a huge material. Many of the reasons are material, not quite all of them, because as you say, some of it has to do with the decline of religion, but one of the big reasons is money. It's very expensive. People really are facing a loss of like that extra £5 they could use to go to the pub even, right? Then the pubs close. We're seeing, by the way, one pub closes per day in the UK. I don't even drink really, and I think this is a big problem. Libraries are being shut down. You can actually see from space, I'm going to make a video on this soon, you can see from space, based on new satellite imagery, that green spaces are getting shut down and shrinking. That's terrible also for the planet, but I could go on, but yes, this is a huge problem. So I do tell people, go and build back social infrastructure, but I use specifically this language, build back, because one of the things that happens when I go speak in places like this, or worse, like a lefty bookshop, is that there are people who say like, great, I'm gonna build a third space. It's gonna have like an Ayurvedic massage center, and then it's gonna have like a sex club upstairs, and like, okay, that's fine, and you can do that if you want, but that's not the third spaces that we need. What we really need is that place that like moms used to take their kids when it rained, that was cheap or free, where the kids could run around and the moms could talk to each other about whatever problems were happening in the neighborhood. We need that space. It probably either just got shut down in the first round of neoliberalism cuts, or is about to get shut down, and you should find that thing, and you should, in whatever complex system of ways, try to rebuild it. Another thing that you might find interesting is the food co-ops that I talk about in my book, which are ways of connecting neighbors while addressing some of their actual material needs. A food co-op is when you basically form a union, but for consumers. And in my case, it means I know 17 of my neighbors. We have a WhatsApp group. We order vegetables wholesale, and we split them up among the 17 of us. And it means that I can get pretty much all the groceries I'm going to need for a week for about £7, maybe less. That's it. Why is this good? Honestly, I don't really care about the cost of the groceries as much as I care about the fact that I now know 17 of my neighbors, and we are doing something for each other. We know about each other's lives. We know what's going on. We have at least some shared concern and goal. That's huge for democracy. You could do that tomorrow. You could make one tomorrow. But there are a lot of other kinds of social infrastructure to build, and the ideal social infrastructure is not only not expensive, not only free, it actually gives you something material that you need. And I would love people in this room to build that. Most of you probably won't. Most of you will probably either build the cool Ayurvedic sex club that doesn't help that much with democracy, or you will not do this. But if you want to, come talk to me. I know the right people. I will connect you to them. Thanks, everyone.
And there'll be the opportunity to talk to Sarah after we've finished. So, well, you gather from having seen Sarah in person what this book is like. It's warm, it's funny, it's clever, it's engaging, it's provocative, it's packed with ideas. So do buy it. Be careful who you give it to, because it's very powerful.
No, give your book to people you hate. Give my book to people you hate.
Are you sure you want to do that?
Yeah, it's a great book because it's kind of passive-aggressive, right? Like, if you don't like your in-laws, give them this book and be like, I just thought you'd like some Marxist sociology. Let's not talk about politics. Perfect.
Anyway, well, so buy the book, give it to anyone, or read it yourself, first of all. So thank you to the How To Academy and to the Conduit Club.
Thank you, Tim, as well, for all the wonderful questions.
Thank you to you, but thank you above all to Sarah Stein Lubrano.